Again, thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you all for coming, my goodness, on a Saturday morning to listen to us speak about these topics that are dear to our heart, as you have seen from Tomás. We are a small band. I know that David said that he can see a lot of research, but on the whole we're a small band, and we have our debates, and as you can see from Tomás, we sometimes agree and we sometimes disagree in a civilised manner. So anyway, I'm coming to the question of monks and monasticism. And first of all, I would like to sort of begin for you to understand the monasticism that I'm talking about. So monasticism involves people living together in a community, which is very important, following a religious life of prayer, study and work. It's a lifestyle that's found throughout the world, really, where monks and nuns dedicate themselves to following a different way of life and rules, some totally devoted to a spiritual life separate from the world, but a lot of others involved in the daily life of the world through teaching, nursing and spiritual guidance. And you find that throughout the major religions, Buddhist monks and female religious, Christian and Hindu, with, interestingly, a core belief in the type of life they follow. From our point of view, in the Christian tradition, monasticism originates in the Middle East in the first centuries of the Christian era, and in North Africa, and we have to remember that background whenever we're talking about monasticism, and even monasticism in Ireland. And then it spreads across the Mediterranean to Gaul and to Iberia. Well, what about Ireland? As you all know, St. Patrick's Confessio, we are very lucky to have it. I think Elva and myself were saying on the way up, sometimes when you read it, it's pretty gloomy stuff, but it's our first testament, really, of what's happening in Ireland, and it's one of the first descriptions by a missioner to following his mission and the difficulties, and also he goes on very much about the successes. And one of them is, I have here, St. Patrick telling us what is happening in Ireland. Never before did they know of God except to serve idols and unclean things, which is a standard description you find among those who are converting, because what is not Christianity, in some cases, is regarded as unclean. But now they have become the people of the Lord and are called the children of God. The sons and daughters of the leaders of the Irish are seen to be monks and virgins of Christ, monachi et virgines Christi, which is exactly what Tomás is saying. You know, the sons and the daughters of the leaders of the Irish. So it's the aristocracy who are gradually taking and converting to Christianity and allowing their sons and their daughters to become monks and virgins of Christ, which is quite important. This is, as you do find with conversion, the conversion happens quite often at the top and among the female aristocrats. And then here is where St. Patrick tells us of an example. There was a blessed Irish woman of noble birth, a most beautiful adult whom I baptized. She came to us a few days later for this reason. She told us that she had received word from a messenger of God who advised her that she should become a virgin of Christ, a Virgo Christi, and she should come close to God. And 6 days later, she took on the life that all virgins of God do. Now, in this case, her father didn't like it, or he's also showing the other side of conversion period. These women suffer persecution and false accusations from their parents, and yet their numbers grow. Well, of course, in some cases they would, because a daughter is useful to a noble family for the very reason of the marriage alliance they might, arrange for the daughter, and therefore they were losing a daughter to such an alliance.
We do not know the number of people of our people who are born there. In addition, there are widows and celibates, 𝐕𝐞𝐽𝐷𝐻 𝐻𝐿𝐼𝐻. And that's very important, because when we think of monasticism, and I will discuss this in a while, we always think of big churches, big estates. But when we're talking of the period of St. Patrick, and we're talking about sort of the 5th century, you are just elsewhere just beginning to see the organisation of religious life, even in Rome, even in Gaul, where religious life as monasticism has established itself in the 5th century. It's really in North Africa and in the Middle East, and it's gradually sort of establishing itself. So, in fact, St. Patrick is right on time. He's right describing the contemporary sort of development of monasticism, and especially among women, because you do find right into Rome and even the Middle East, you find widows or women and men who are married and then decide that they go their separate, not necessarily separate ways, they stay under the one roof, but they they dedicate themselves to a religious life. And this is what Patrick is talking about. Now we are talking about the lesser, the poorer people. Of all these, those held in slavery work hardest. They bear even terror and threats, but the Lord gives the grace to so many of the women, which is very interesting that he picks out the women, multisex ancilli suis, who serve him. Even when it is forbidden, they bravely follow his example. So this is telling you that beneath the nobility, beneath the aristocracy, they're slaves, and we know that they had slaves as within their households and even on their lands, that the women are becoming Christian. And that is a pattern that you do find among aristocratic families, and clearly from what Patrick is saying, even down to the lowest group of people in society. Now, what does Patrick tell us about where all this might be coming from? Well, he tells us from the beginning that effectively, wherever it is in Britain, he is British, but he's also within the late Roman British society. We don't know exactly. There's been huge debate as to the place name he mentions. Some people say it's the Severn Valley, some people say it's somewhere around Dumbarton in Scotland. We don't know. But he does say, I could wish to leave them, his flock in Ireland, to go to Britain. I would willingly do this, and I'm prepared for this, as if to visit my home country and my parents. But importantly, he says, not only that, but I would like to go to Gaul, to visit the brothers and to see the faces of the saints of my Lord, whatever that means. But his reference to Gaul, and he does refer to it elsewhere in his letter, is important from the point of view of monasticism. Now this is not, I don't know how it's going to turn up here, but here we have Gaul in the 5th and 6th centuries, and where we have the important flowering of monasticism. So, for example, here we have Tours, or Marmoutier, which is where St. Martin of Tours, in the 4th century, he establishes what becomes one of the most important monasteries in Gaul. Further up, where we see here, which is Trier, and we do have from earlier archaeological material, particularly to do with Newgrange, an indication that there are links in the late Roman Empire period between Ireland and Trier. It's also where St. Augustine spends some time, and of course St. Augustine being one of the fathers of monasticism, so there is monasticism there. And we go further down to here, which is where the Jura Fathers in the 5th and 6th centuries write a rule, and also have a suite of monasteries in the Jura Mountains. And this very important kind of cluster here of First of all, Marseille, where John Cassian, one of the writers about monasticism, the fundamentals of monasticism, he ends up there coming across the Mediterranean, and his works are known in Ireland. You also have the beautiful monastery. In fact, I was saying when I was looking at the website now, it still is a monastery of Lerran, just off the coast in the south of France, where you can have a retreat, and a place I intend going to. But here you have a very important site, monastic site. First of all, a hermitage, then becomes an important monastic site, but that it creates a whole group of bishops who feed into the developing diocese of Gaul. So you have, for example, you've got the founder, Honoratus, you've got Hilarius, and you've got Caesarius of Arles, who is one of the first to write a rule for women in monastic, following a religious life, and sets up actually a female monastery in Arles, which is just where I have marked on here. So this is what's happening in Gaul from the 4th century onwards, and another one which I hadn't marked out, but here, a place called Saint Maurice d'Augon, another very important early monastery over the Alps on the way to Rome. And we have to keep that in mind once Christianity settles down in Ireland, the number of people going to Rome for various reasons. And we have evidence that they do go through Saint Maurice. So this is what's happening in Gaul. Now, when we look at Armagh, and we've moved into the 7th century, the Gaulish sites I was showing you, they're mainly 4th, 5th, 6th century. But in Armagh we have a description. In the city of Armagh, Christians of both sexes are seen to live together in religion, from the coming of the faith to the present day, almost inseparably. And to this aforesaid city also exist 3 orders. Again, our virgins, our penitents, who are likely to be, they are not necessarily following a rule. They may be like these married people who have separated into some form of religious life. Those serving church in legitimate matrimony, that's them actually. And these 3 orders are allowed to hear the word of preaching in the church of the northern quarter on Sundays always. So what it's saying about Armagh is that Armagh is already, by the 7th century, and I suspect earlier, is divided into particular quarters, and that you have churches, very tiny, I suspect, that are dedicated or used by different people of these 3 orders. In the southern basilica, you have the bishops and the priests and the anchorites, so the really holy ones, and the other religious offer virtuous praise. So what is this modelled on? So we had Gaul and all the flourishing monasteries. This is not the best slide, but what it is, it's Rome and the Caelian Hill. So when you come to, for example, Gregory the Great, Pope Gregory the Great, who writes the life of Saint Benedict of Nursia, who also writes about monasticism. During that period, the Rome is being developed. So we always think that Ireland is behind in everything, but we are not. We're in touch all the time, and things are happening in Rome or in Gaul that have a wave through to Ireland very quickly. And that what you have here with the Caelian Hill is, I think, what Armagh is trying to do. So you have the very large churches. So St. John Lateran's, which is of course now the papal church and has been very important from the beginning. And then you have all these smaller churches surrounding it. So that, and San Clemente, for example, which is was a ritual Mithraic of the Mithraic religion, which is very much associated with the Roman army. So you have on the Caelian Hill, you see, you have St. Gregorio Magno, so the church of Pope Gregory. You have here part of Rome, and this is just one part of Rome, there are other parts, where you have central main church and then smaller churches around it. I think that Armagh is possibly following that model on a much smaller scale. So this is what Armagh is looking like in the 7th century, if not earlier. And then we should think of the point I made about Ireland being far behind. Well, if you look at the great age of the great founders, and I only picked out some of them, there's so many of them, and their contemporaries on the continent, you see that they're more or less contemporary, or not far behind. So Ninian of Whitthorn, late 5th century, Mochoy of Nendrum, late 5th century, Macnis of Connor, early 6th, British, sort of early 6th, Gildas, the famous Gildas, who's referred to in Irish texts as being one of the transmitters of monastic religious life and its rules to Ireland. Finian of Moville or Clonard, we're not sure. Again, he's a bit later. Kieran of Clonmacnoise, early 6th century. Columba of Iona, born early 6th century. Covgill, a little bit later, like Columba. Columbanus, that bit later. And Kevin of Glendalough, particularly later into the 7th century. But then when you look at Benedict of Nursa, he dies in 547. So, you know, we're not far. Gregory the Great, in fact, Columbanus is talking to Gregory the Great in 604. Isidore of Seville, who has puts together a rule, a monastic rule, and is known to be in Ireland because his great work, the etymologies, the 𝐒𝐴𝐻𝑒𝑚𝑜LOGIAe, are known from a very early period in Ireland. He's 636. The Jura Fathers, again, late 5th, early 6th century, and Caesarius of Arles, 542. So we're not behind when it comes to the great founders of monasteries. And again, keep thinking, I'm talking about people, a community following a religious life and some form of rule. We're not far behind. In fact, we're fairly contemporary. And we're so contemporary, and we love monasticism so much that Columbanus cries to Pope Gregory the Great and said, "What is to be done about those monks who, for the sake of God and inflamed by the desire for a more perfect life, impugn their vows, leave the places of their first profession, and against their abbot's will, impelled by monastic fervour, either relapse or, importantly, flee to the desert?" So they don't stay in the community. They want to be more ascetic, so they head off into the wilderness. Finian, who may be more likely Finian of Moville, the writer, questioned Gildas about them, and he sent a most polished reply. And yet, through the zeal for learning, anxiety grows even greater. So in other words, there's a problem here. You have a new religion, you have probably younger men and women and who are full of fervour for Christianity, and not only are they not staying in their monastic communities, but they're feeling that they have to follow the desert fathers as they understand it and go into their own wildernesses. And Columbanus is sending this as an issue from the Irish Church when he's writing around 600 AD. Now I come to our own perspectives of monasticism. What is a monastery? What is monastic life? Well, as I said, it's a religious, spiritual way of life. Some do work, some just pray. And I'm linking in with Tomás here now. There are various functions of different churches which we don't understand. Well, Tomás has from their great project. But the point is that you'll see all around on tourism and general descriptions the word monastery. They're not all monasteries. As Tomás showed, there are very large ecclesiastical settlements that have an element of a monastery, that own a lot of land, and there are churches serving a larger community or familial churches, just as Tomás showed you. And we also see this reference to Celtic monasticism versus Norman monasticism that is usually associated with the Benedictine rule. This is not so. If you read about monasticism all the way through, let's say from the Middle East through to Ireland, what you have, and I will come to it in a minute, are basic precepts that are all the same and common, but they are in their own cultural milieu. And as for the standard normal Benedictine monasticism, well, you don't have that until around the 9th or 10th century, when the normalisation of the Benedictine rule becomes the normal rule. But even the Benedictine rule has the same precepts as rules elsewhere and as our own sources show. And of course, the other reason why people regard the Irish form of monasticism as Celtic and different is because our sources are different. We have sources in Latin and we have sources in Irish, in the vernacular, which makes it unusual because you don't have sources in the vernacular in a lot of cases. Ireland is almost exceptional there for such early sources, and I'll show them to you in a minute. So therefore, what scholars of monasticism are now calling monasticisms. In other words, forms of monasticism that fit into their own cultural and environmental background or context. And what we have in Ireland, and indeed it's always talked about Celtic monasticism, Breton, Cornish, Irish, Scottish, and Welsh. Yes, there are commonalities, but most of the commonalities are found in monasticism everywhere. And for example, I've taken two extracts from the Rule of St. Benedict, which fits anyone who's following a monastic rule. See how the Lord in his love shows us the way of life. Clothed then with faith and the performance of good works, let us set out on this way, with the gospel for our guide, that we may deserve to see him who called us to his kingdom. Anyone following a religious rule and as a monastic would believe in that. We must then prepare our hearts and bodies for the battle of holy obedience to his instructions. What is not possible to us by nature, let us ask the Lord to supply by the help of grace. You have that throughout the Irish material as well. So even though this is supposedly the standard rule, it is describing, in the form of how St. Benedict did it, exactly what you would find elsewhere, but written in different ways. So the community, or the ideal monastic structure, because that was the structure that was regarded as the ideal structure, to be in a community. To run off into the desert was really confined to those who could do it, and it was probably done at certain times of the year. And we do have a lot of place names called 𝐤𝐴𝐻𝐻 in Ireland, which is interestingly bringing the concept of North Africa and the desert to Ireland in a place name. But when you look at them, and Tomás has written about this as well, it's on islands, coastal islands, islands on lakes and rivers. Anyway, the fundamental precepts of monasticism: obedience, so obedience to your greater authority, obedience to God; humility, poverty, purity of heart, fear of God, and love of God and your neighbour, especially within your community. A lot of words used that you find in the sources: Miles Christi, the soldier of Christ; Servus Dei, the servant of Christ; 𝐂𝐚𝐬𝐧𝐝, the client of Christ. And the latter, the 𝐂𝐚𝐬𝐧𝐝, are a particular group who appear in the 8th century, mid to late 8th century. Probably people who are very concerned with liturgy, with education, and with putting together the rule as is happening elsewhere. So I thought I would take a few of relatively local. I've gone north, and just to give you an idea of the different types of foundations and what they were. So first of all, we have here the larger photograph, Devonish. Well, Devonish founded again in that sort of 5th, 6th century period. Devonish is what I would call a mixed type of settlement. So it has a very strong ascetic, monastic side. So it has a religious community following some form of rule. You have the 𝐂𝐫𝐴 there, this group of highly ascetic people, but then they continue, interestingly, in Devonish to the 15th century and change in their type of lifestyle and what they're doing as it moves through the centuries. In Devonish, you have people who are abbots, who are called abbots. You've got an anchorite abbot. You've got very important literary authors, a man called 𝐂𝐤𝐧𝐻 𝐂𝐻𝐳𝐷, who in the 12th century writes a very famous poem about the women of Ireland. And then you've got Antrim, the smaller, of which you have the Round Tower, and you have, of course, the Round Tower in Devonish. And the Round Tower is really, I think, hopefully Tomás agrees with me, I mean, on the whole, our 11th, 12th century phenomenon. And it's to do with the power of a church trying to show that they can build something as, you know, from an engineering point of view, amazing, sitting on nothing, except in a small pattern appearing that I can see if ever there is any excavation, well, it wasn't excavation in the 19th century, that burials are found at the foot of these round towers. So I wonder if they are associated as well with a founder's tomb or something like that, marking a founder's tomb. With Antrim, the link is with Bangor. You have abbots of Bangor who are also come from Antrim, 𝐸𝐻𝐻. The relics of 𝐶𝐽𝐫𝐢𝐬𝐴 of Bangor are brought to Antrim in 824 during the Viking raids. And later on, it kind of loses its importance and is burnt in the 11th and 12th centuries. So it seems to lose its importance. But still, we have to ask the question as to why there is a round tower there. I don't think that it's a hugely important monastic site, that it is a satellite of Bangor. Here we have Inishmaach Saint, or 𝐸𝐴𝐺 on Lough Erne. Well, what is that? You have very few references to it, in fact only one. It is owned by the 12th century by the major hereditary families of family of 𝐕𝐺𝐻𝐻, the O'Flanagans of Devonish. So by the 12th century, it's part of their lands. But are we talking about, because it's on its own island, is it some form of retreat for the monastic community of Devonish? For example, do they spend time there at Lent or at some part of the season, or for reparation of their sins? So it is a question. And of course, the issue as well, and we'll come to that in a second, is that a lot of the buildings that we see are much later. They're not necessarily of the early medieval period, but you assume, as Tomás has said, that they are either extensions of something earlier or on the site of something earlier. And of course then we find Nendrum, the great one here, which I think is a very, very interesting site, and really one from the historian's point of view that we should go back to and have a good look at, because the archaeologist with Tom McErlane has done magnificent work there, and there have been excavations, and of course the tidal mill, which I see is 7th, 8th century, is a feat of engineering. But when you look at the historical side, most of the people mentioned are bishops. And I want to say about bishops, there has been, again, a perception that you have abbots, you have monasticism, you have decline and reform, but you have bishops in all of these major sites as well. And having a bishop and a scribe, which you do have with a Colman in 873, who's a bishop of Nendrum, he's the scribe and abbot of Nendrum, you have a religious community there. Because I think the bishop is the core of the religious community in many of those very large sites. So if anyone is interested to do further historical work, do it on Nendrum. There is a huge amount to be said about Nendrum in all sorts of ways. But I think Nendrum is one of those models where you have what Tomás called about large settlement, ecclesiastical settlement, core of a monastic community, but also a community involved in, for example, milling and other economic practices, and probably has lands as well, with tenants who are also called, and I'll come to this in a minute, monig, monk and tenant. And finally, I have, and this is, in fact, I was delighted to hear about 𝐶𝐚𝐬𝐿, because it's a much better example, that this is Skerry, or Skirrid, overlooked by 𝐒𝐞𝐦𝐢𝐴, supposedly having the imprint of St. Patrick's foot, which is actually mentioned by Tíorchán on Murrachu in the 7th century. So I wonder if Skirrid, on the side of the mountain, very closely associated with St. Patrick, whether that is, first of all, a site of pilgrimage. And when I mean pilgrimage, I don't mean pilgrimage as we think of it nowadays, of hundreds of people going there, but a very strong association with St. Patrick. And I wonder if it's one of Tomás's familial churches, or even maybe bigger. We'd need to do a study of that area, Tomás, to see what the settlement pattern is. But this is halfway towards 𝐒𝐴𝐻. Very, very important and interesting site, but of the smaller church. And of course, the fabric of it is much later. So what was there beforehand is an issue. Now, I just run very quickly through the sources, because as I said, the sources are different. When you're looking at sources in England, or indeed on the continent, you have a lot of charters and even letters and so on, which we don't have exactly the same in Ireland. But we have canon laws in Latin and Irish laws in the vernacular that talk about the church and the structure of the church. We've got a whole group of chronicles or annals that tell us about who was in charge of all the different types of churches. Regulatory texts, rules, monastic rules, mainly in the vernacular, and that's why they're regarded as different, because they're not in Latin, but they are saying a lot of the same as your classical rule in Latin. Again, calendars and martyrologies, that they record dozens of saints' cults, native saints' cults, which is very, very interesting, because like Tomás was saying, some of these cults, you only have the one reference to them, you may have them in a place name, and that's it, you have no more. But these are these small, important churches, which are dotted, as you saw from Tomás's map, all over the country. You have monastic books, we have manuscripts and commentaries, we have poems teaching the Psalms in Ireland, and stories about how to behave and how monks and nuns should behave, but monks particularly. And we have lots of prayers in Latin and in the vernacular, all of which touch on, or many of which touch on, the question of humility, the tears that you have to shed as repentance, all those themes that you find in general in monastic literature. And of course I said material and culture, which Tomás has shown you. And then when we come to the monasticism in medieval Ireland, you can divide it between the religious community, the spiritual community, for example, the bishop, the episcop, the sagart, the confessor, the onamchara, and they're quite often confessors to the aristocracy. The feirléighean, the head of the monastic school, but feirléighean are also men, as we know at the moment, who are involved in vernacular literature. The cenriagla, the head of the rule. And then all these words for hermits. Anchora, an anchorite, dísirtach, the one who's out in the desert, similarly with díhrevog out in the desert, �MoghDé, the servant of God, �Croivdach, a pious person, �Dóradé, the exile of God. So these are the ones who are really following an ascetic rule. These are the serious ones who are quite often seen to be out in the desert. Similarly, the Miles Christi fighting the good fight, and St. Michael the Archangel is their great saint. The 𝐒𝐞𝐽𝐬𝐴, and that's the Irish for the 𝐕𝐸𝐴𝐺𝐻 Christi, or the Soldier of God, 𝐴LAIchur, the Pilgrim. The 𝐂𝐚𝐳, and I will not go on, that's a whole other lecture, but this particular group of men, a lot of them bishops in the 8th century, who take on, I think, an interest, particular interest in the liturgy, in educational matters in the church, in training, and also in asceticism. And 𝐸LAIch, I will come to in a minute, the woman. So on the other hand, if you have one of these very big monasteries, you have to have a household. And the household is normally around the 𝐵, the abbot, and they're called the 𝐕𝐴𝐺𝐻 or the 𝐶𝐵. You have the words, and they're all mixed up in the Chronicles, so sometimes you don't know whether they are on the spiritual side or on the economic, administrative side. So you 𝐸𝐴𝐺𝐻, or the 𝐶𝐵, who's the hereditary, who is the core of the founder, who is following the founder. And then you've got a secondary abbot, you've got the mayor, who is collecting the tributes for somewhere like Armagh. That's where you find them very much. The household person, the 𝐕𝐴𝐺𝐻, they normally have a guest house, therefore they have somebody in charge of that, and you can see references to that in Iona. Also the 𝐴𝐴𝐺𝐻, similarly, somebody who is dealing with guests coming to the settlement, the 𝐴𝐵, the key holder, and then monach. And monachos, to us, means a monk. But as 𝐂𝐽𝐢𝐴𝐺𝐻 showed, and I agree with Tomás about disagreeing with 𝐂𝐽𝐢𝐴𝐺𝐻, but you have lay tenants on the lands of these very large ecclesiastical settlements. And whether they're better or not than those who are not, I doubt it. But they may be under stricter rule or more expected. But basically what they're doing is they're farming the lands and bringing the fruits of the lands into the central ecclesiastical settlement. Now, I'm almost at the end here. Here we have 𝐶𝐜𝐫. This is where I come to the women. A very fine church, a very fine tradition, associated with Saint Monena. And what I want to dispel are many myths about the female religious. First of all, the 𝐸𝐺𝐻. We see 𝐸𝐺𝐻 associated with all sorts of weird and wonderful ladies, but we have to always remember that the name 𝐸𝐺𝐻 is based on the pallia, or the veil, which is a Christian form. It comes from Latin. Therefore, the 𝐸𝐺𝐻 isn't always your weird and wonderful woman. She's also the veiled one. And that can be, like in St. Patrick, the widow, or the woman who dedicates herself as a virgin for her life. We have, as I said, all forms of female religious life. We don't see them as, we always think of Kildare, but 𝐶𝐜𝐫, I think, is a very good example, without looking at Kildare, of people who are virgins, widows, married women who take a vow of chastity. Normally under the authority of a bishop, a priest, or an abbot, or one of the Anam Chara, a confessor, normally a bishop and abbot. And this is the case with 𝐶𝐜𝐫. It's a satellite almost, or it's the female side of Armagh. And you find a lot of female names, saints' names associated with smaller sites. They're all over Leinster. Where I come from in Dalkey, County Dublin, the female dedication is 𝐵𝐺Net. We have one reference to 𝐵𝐺Net in the 7th century and no more. And that seems to be is what Tomás said, that land is given to women. Churches are founded among the nobles, but because of the inheritance law, they don't necessarily continue. They become a familial church. But they unbelievably retain the name of the original founders, or the woman who was granted the original foundation land. An exception, of course, is Monena of 𝐶𝐜𝐫, and Elva has written about Monena. I think she's amazing because there's a whole suite of lives about Monena that you can sort of read layers into, but there's also a dossier of hymns in Latin as if there's a dossier of the saint kept in Killeavy and a list of abbesses. So we don't find that normally. In fact, even with Kildare, we barely have that. Just a little bit more with Bridget, but Manana is often forgotten in all of this. And just as an example of the type of woman who would have ended up in Killeavy, Elva, daughter of the Abbot of Armagh, which is interesting, wife of the King of Ayrshire, which is the kingdom around Armagh, or to one side of it, and she becomes the abbess of Monina, and she dies in 1077 in penitence. Now, whether she is stuck in there by the father and the king has died, or I didn't check up actually, but the fact that she's put in there as a noble woman, which is what we always think of Anglo-Saxon and continental monasteries to be, you find that in Kildare and in this a really good example. And we know that Killeavy is served by the priests of Armagh. And finally, I bring you very, very quickly to Armagh, because Armagh is your classic, almost, I know Charlie Doherty, late lamented Charlie Doherty, taught me in the 1970s first about the monastic town, which caused huge controversy right across the continent and England, whether there was such a thing as a monastic town. Of course there is, because if you have a settlement that, as Tomás was showing, there's ironworking, there are all different parts to it. Think again of Rome on a much bigger scale, but here you have, in probably 12th century Armagh, you've got the central church dedicated to St. Patrick, you've got the abbot's house. If you see here, it's like if you go to Norwich, you've got the abbot's house and presumably a settlement around him. You've got the 12th century foundation, which is supposedly Augustinian, becomes Augustinian. You've got a market cross. You've got where the 𝐂𝐽𝐬𝐧𝐝 are, and they are probably involved with the hospice. We know that there's a hospice as a guest house in Armagh. And then you've got these smaller churches, either dedicated, for example, to Columba, or here the southern church, the Sowell, which may be to do with St. Patrick and perhaps a relic, St. Bridget's Church. So here we have, and then all the different enclosures and the different sections or sectors of Armagh. So here we have a very complex ecclesiastical settlement owning huge tracts of land with the whole kind of gamut of the hierarchies and the officials of Armagh. And my suggestion has been that this part here, where you have the 𝐂𝐽𝐬𝐧𝐝 and the Sowell and the 𝐶, that here is where you have the monastic community. So in other words, in these very large sites, Armagh, Derry, Glendalough, Kells, Lismore, all of these, you have a large ecclesiastical settlement, and then within that you have the monastic community following a rule as we understand it in general. Thank you.